Our research question is, what can be said about the role of women and gender in 1940s China based on the films To Live and Spring in a Small Town? It's important to understand the gender roles that were in place in 1940s China, to understand how these films either reflect reality or perhaps contrive reality and tell a different story altogether. We are trying to analyze whether these films are an accurate historical portrayal of gender roles or if perhaps they are more entertainment, perhaps an exaggeration of what truly happened in the 1940s in China.
Each of us will contribute a different approach through which we will view the research question: historical, sociological, and gender studies, and cinematic. This allows 3 equal attempts at answering the research question.
Spring in a Small Town, directed by Fei Mu in 1948, is a story of a weak and sickly husband, his estranged wife, and the arrival of an old classmate of the husband who was once madly in love with the wife. To Live, made in 1994, a film showcasing the life and times of a family in 1940s China whose patriarch finds hard times after struggling to overcome a gambling problem.
When detailing women's roles in 1940s China, it is imperative to shy from sweeping generalizations. Yu-Wen, a character from Spring in a Small Town, is a cinematic representation of a rural woman. While she does fulfill her duties as wife in a traditional sense, her emotional attachment to another man and distaste for monotony is ever present. Although this film was banned by the CCP, Yu-Wen is in many ways a muted version of the way women are portrayed in Yu Ru's 1942 Distant Love. In this work, what could be called the prototypical revolutionary woman is presented. Women here are highly intelligent with a certain degree of personal freedom and anti-Japanese sentiment, not unlike Red Sorghum. While neither text can give a definitive look at women's roles, they suggest what the ideal nationalist woman may have been. There are other accounts that piece together the roles of 1940s Chinese women. Su Qin's 10 Years of Marriage is a quasi-autobiographical look at marriage and gender structure in China from a female perspective. The female in the work is representative of Shanghai as a whole. Published in 1943, the work was a huge success and by 1948 had over 12 editions printed. Qing likens marriage to enslavement, and with the spread of revolutionary ideology and Japanese occupation, it is telling that a non-fiction book would focus on gender roles and be widely appealing. Functioning as an autonomous woman, she has a follow-up work in 1947 and 1948 that is written in much the same way. Although CCP propaganda would suggest equality for women, Qing was the target of communist exclusion, though this could be due to her intellectual status and not to her femininity. This work is an example of the numerous and widely popular Chinese female authors of the 1940s. Looking at the way in which 1940s roles are remembered is significant in the modern period. Jai Zhen, a character in the 1994 cinematic feature To Live, suggests rampant misogyny and serves as a force for feminism. It is important to historicize media in the 1990s in order to properly gauge the way in which To Live makes gender commentary. To understand women in the public sphere, Ken Yu's Yu Wai Shi functions effectively. Written in the late 1980s, it is quasi-autobiographical, much like Su Qin's work, and presents women as somewhat autonomous. Familial structure and traditional societal structures are evident, but there is a lack of clearly assigned roles. Q's work paints a picture of women with a lost memory, attempting not for an ideal of equality, but merely to create a space for women in society. The character also, much like previous women, is staunchly anti-communist. To understand the private sphere of 1980s, 1990s women, Lin Bai's corpus is excellent. Her widely popular novels often depict a girl who is at odds with herself. Women in private settings are abused by patriarchal structures in these works. This is mainly due to women attempting to find womanhood in the 1990s. Women of the 1960s and 1970s were seen as equally powerful as men, especially in the physical sense. In attempting to construct womanhood in the 1990s, the new wave of writers looked back to women of the 1940s and reconstructed history. All things considered, Spring in a Small Town takes women to be subservient, but acting against traditional values. The popularity of Yu Ru and Sun Quan, in addition to an entire host of forgotten female writers in the 1940s, suggests that this representation may have been true for some but false for others. To Live places a heavy emphasis on misogynistic structure and shows how a woman would attempt to carve out a place in society in the 1940s. Based on the literature from the 1980s and 1990s, it can be said that To Live is not accurately representing 1940s women, but rather representing projections of 1990s gender. The works of Ken Yu and Lin Bai resonate strongly with the character Jai Zhen. From a historical perspective, women's roles in the 1940s are complex and in large part regional.
Now let's look at the gender studies and sociological approach to this research question. In the progressive left-wing film tradition before 1949, many films were produced to represent the plight of Chinese women. Women's bodies were the bearers of suffering and cruelty in a dehumanizing society, as can be seen in films of the 1940s. It's interesting to note that most writers who gave women new configurations during that period were male. Sociologists Liu and Sheldon find the Chinese female of 1940s symbolizes the victim of oppression in the form of child bride, concubinage, slavery, and the like. The male represents the agency of revolutionary change through a series of familiar symbols and characters: male commissar, armed struggle, the gun, the party, and the sign. However, not all cinematic storylines from the 1940s show suppressed women and domineering men. Fei Mu was marked as a reactionary for this film due to its progressive nature. Yuan, the wife, struggles with overcoming her dutifulness as a bored housewife and embracing an electric love affair with an old lover. At the time, Confucian thought still ruled China, so to see a woman embrace her sexuality and female attraction, to live an independent life where she seeks her own desires rather than the desires of her husband, was deviant to the patriarchal norm. Zhang Yimou, director of To Live, mutually portrays Chinese masculinity in trouble and crisis. He offers the viewers spectacles of the inability of men to save their spouses and children, as can be seen when Fugui loses his house and family to a gambling problem and struggles to employ puppeteering skills to keep his wife and children happy and healthy through troubled communist times. Jia Zhen, Fugui's wife in To Live, leaves her husband after his gambling problem erases all their goods and even their house. She struggles to raise her daughter on her own, finding a low-paid job giving water to laborers to keep her family afloat. Zhang's films seem to depict feminist oppression in a patriarchal society, while he explains that using women to make a statement in his films is purely coincidental. What I want to express, he says, is the Chinese people's oppression and confinement, which has been going on for thousands of years. Women express this more clearly on their bodies because they bear a heavier burden than men. Zhang does not intentionally use women's oppression to inform audiences of the misogyny rampant during 1940s China, but finds the image of a suppressed woman in a powerful representation of the oppression of China as a whole.
Now we are going to look at film's portrayal of Chinese women in the 1940s, with Spring in a Small Town, made in the 40s, and To Live, made in 1994. Both films are trying to show how women were lonely, betrayed, abused, and sad most of their lives. Being made 50 years apart from each other, you would think that the film To Live, made in 1994, would have a more accurate portrayal of how women were treated because they could have years of research with books and textbooks. However, through studying these films and doing some research on my own, I found that the film Spring in a Small Town is more accurately correct. The image of the 1940s woman gradually changed with the modernization of the Chinese thought. To Live shows Jia Zhen living a life of loneliness because her husband, Fugui, is gambling all of their family's money away. She's making it clear to her husband that he has to choose between her and their daughter and gambling. He chose gambling, and she packs up and leaves her husband. Normally, if women were to leave their husbands and families in the 1940s, they would be abused by their husbands or fathers, or even both. The film To Live does not show Jia Zhen being abused. It's almost seen as being normal, a 1990s trait. In the film Spring in a Small Town, Jiao is trapped in her home with her husband, living a life in his daydreams. She sees her husband, Lian, twice a day, if that. She wants to escape. She wants to run, to have a life of happiness. Her husband treats her unfairly and harshly. He gets angry at her for the smallest of things. She is not able to leave him without any consequences. This is more of a realistic portrayal of women in the 1940s. In conclusion, we find that the film Spring in a Small Town is made more historically correct, even though many would think, with all of the modern technology and research that was put into the film To Live, that would be the one to be more accurately correct.
Thus, the women in Zhang's films are not really women, but rather are objectified as symbols. Though Fei Mu is a man behind the lens, he lent a knowing eye to women's oppression and showed the true strength of femininity through his male gaze.
To suggest women were dominated and play a silent role is pure fiction, but to suggest women as having full agency would also be false. The 1940s marks a transitional period wherein women are acting more and more independently, and the message of equality grew. Literature discussed previously shows this transitional 1940s period and how it has been forgotten in the modern age.